Okay, yeah, I hope you folks are ready for like future talk. And something to note, like I thought about like what could actually be useful for like future founders. And I think there's a lot of focus on like the product side. And of course, AI and etc. changes that. But I actually also think like it's really useful to think about like future organizations and how they are going to evolve and be shaped. Yeah. So that is basically what this will be about. And every time I have opportunity, I kind of promote my home city where I was born, Jajce. If you've not been there, you should go. I'm not sure, is there anybody from Bosnia here? No, there isn't. Okay. Yeah, so let's go through this. One of the core elements is that, and something like maybe the core inside it, like every platform shift rewires the org. And we can clearly see this, in some of like, I mean, I have been doing this for like 20 years, and we have been through like a lot of these, revolutions. Like one is like SaaS. It kind of like moved. So like the sales process was very different from like selling CDs, to like actually selling, software. And then also it became global. So, you could target like the US market from Europe, etc. The same thing with web apps, and like Todoist was one of the early web apps, and we were like, kind of innovative in that space. But it also really changed, not only like products, but also organizations and how you access software and apps, and of course mobile as well. Like if you look at Google Maps, it actually I think is one of the maybe like most revolutionary products, because it really changed, for instance, how we navigate, how we travel, how we shop, how we find restaurants, and etc. And then, something that has been very dear to my heart is like remote and async. And we were like some of the early teams that actually adopted this way of working. And that really like changed, like the talent we could actually access, especially where I started, like, which was Chile. Like in Chile, when like I started, like you couldn't really find a designer, So it kind of enabled a new way of working. And I think the same thing happens for AI. And all of these things is kind of like for instance, like remote plus async means that talent becomes global. AI means that intelligence becomes abundant. And there's like very clear like secondary effects of all of these things. Another thing, and I hope you have seen this curve before. If not, like you should really go and research this. It's like how technology gets adopted. So basically, if you have like on the x-axis time and you have growth, you basically have an X curve. And then like in the growth stage, for instance, AI is right now in the growth stage. You basically have almost like exponential growth. And then at some point it matures and kind of becomes a more boring market. The reason why I mentioned this is a lot of times it's actually like very useful to adopt technology or innovate in the growth stage. So for instance, right now, like if you're doing SaaS innovations, like you're already late by like 10 or 20 years. Yeah. So something to note about this is like we have, been doing this for many years. I think also we have been part of like different revolutions, and especially like remote first. Like when we started to do this, like investors that we talked to thought we were crazy because nobody was really doing remote work, and it was like very like you couldn't trust people across the world, and blah blah. Same thing is just like bootstrapped and independent and stuff. And the reason why I mentioned this is like I also actually want to do this, and I have not really figured this out yet, but I also want us to have like different default and innovate in the AI space in terms of how we structured, because I think it can be a huge advantage. And this is basically the modern org, and some ideas I will share with you, which I think will kind of be maybe applicable. Yeah. So if you look at like, I'm not sure like how many of you have read about Block, like firing 40% of their people or laying off, or like the recent things. Like if you look at the memos that the founders post, they're kind of all centered around like different topics. But if you kind of like summarize it, it's smaller teams, fewer layers, hands-on leaders, more leverage per person, and AI and agents diffused with people. Yeah, and I do think something to note here is you can actually build the modern org, and I think if you are starting up, like you should not copy the organizations from the past. You should try to see like how will the organizations look like in the future, and then maybe start with implementing some of these ideas. Yeah, so I will just specify some of like our philosophies here, and honestly, like we are still kind of figuring stuff out. So like this isn't like the definitive list, and I think we're all learning how to actually do this. Like in most other things, I do think like starting with the basics helps a lot. And I know like I actually thought about removing this because it kind of maybe is a given, but same thing is like with engineering or design. I do think actually you need to have a mastery of the basics. And on the company building, organizational building, I still think this applies. So for instance, like you need to answer like, why are you doing this? What is the mission? What is the mission for yourself? What is the mission for a company? Then you need also to define the core values of the company. And lastly, think long term. And I think, so I have a bunch of like founders I help sometimes with, and I feel like they don't really can answer these very clearly. And then it kind of becomes like very messy, the whole thing. And even this can actually help, like if, for instance, if you adopt AI or agents, that they actually know like what is your company's vision or mission. Then another thing, and this is also something we've applied a lot to Doist, and I think this is kind of remote and async culture, is default to writing. Like don't default to meetings where you have no notes and you just have knowledge inside people's head. And it means like logging down decisions, trade-offs, plans, feedback, context. And the powerful thing here is like it's super helpful for people. Like this is the only way you can actually make remote work, but it's also super powerful for agents and AIs because they actually have context. Another thing we have also done for many years now is like having small and fluid teams, and I think also this is like super critical. So that means like you have like a small team with like a very clear goal. They form, ship, learners resemble, and then also another element is that given that things change so much, you actually need to have fluidity inside your teams. So that means like you don't have just one team that's, for instance, working on login or like search, because maybe search won't really be relevant, and you may actually need to work on something else or something like that. And so, this is like maybe a whole talk that can be used on this. I have like seen many different structures of how companies operate. And I thought actually for many years that our structure was like bad because we would just like spend so much time on like assembling and reassembling teams. But in a market that changes like so fast, like right now, actually this ability to just like reassemble and like set new goals and people are not shocked by that, that's a huge like advantage. And this is maybe like a very controversial for some. The thing to note is like Doist is about 110 people right now, and I actually still spend a lot of time like coding. I like it, so but I do think actually it's a huge advantage, and I think like having leaders that are hands-on and actually know the craft is really critical. So this is like something we have like really gone all into. And if you look at like, for instance, some of the memos that the much larger companies post, is they actually also want to have this property. And it's like much easier to implement right now when you're small than implement this later on, because you will need to hire and promote very differently if this is kind of a core property of leadership. Yeah, and the reason like why this is like so critical is that you can actually be a great like design leader if you actually don't really know much about design, or like what you knew was maybe applicable like 10 years ago or something like that. And you need to be deep in the details to actually stay relevant, especially right now when like things are changing so fast. Yeah. Another element as well is like if you look at some of the studies, like for instance, like great engineers, they will not respect like your opinion if you're not also a great engineer. Like especially if that opinion is like about architecture or like deadlines or something like that. So I do think this is a really, really critical element. Another thing as well is like rewarding impact. And I know like, most of us try to do this, but like most company, like you have a hierarchy, you look at vanity metrics, for instance, like code pushed or like PRs pushed, or the time people enter and leave, or something else. I really think like you need to define like what impact is for you, and then like evaluate that and reward that. And then there's also another element here that you can also innovate on is like how you compensate and how you align incentives. So for us, for instance, like we pay the same thing to ICs as to management. And the reason is like, if you have like an incredible, for instance, like product manager, like they can create so much value and as much value as like, head of something. Okay. And right now, like something we are building on is really like how to incorporate our organization that like where both people and agents thrive. And honestly, like this is still something we're figuring out, but I can just like tell you a bit about the two elements that we're working on right now. One is we call the Doist OS. So basically what it is, and I can like recommend trying to implement something like this, is like it's a cloud code repository where we basically store our skills across the organization. And then this Doist OS is connected to all of our tools. And what this enables is, for instance, like a CX person, or maybe a finance person can actually get going and get this cloud code instance to create a report. And then it actually knows how to go in and fetch private data in our databases. And then it can resemble this. And this has been incredible. Of course, like for engineering, this is not like magic because, most of us can use cloud code. But for instance, like for a finance person, this is like magic. Especially you can do this like in a secure way, and like you should do it in a secure way, where you can actually like just give the agent like skills and tools so they can actually access all of the private data. So that's one element. The other element that we're also incorporating more into, and this may be our first like real agent, is something we'll call Doistbot. So basically we have a few engineers that are maintaining this, and it's basically an agent that reviews all of our code. And right now you can actually also like do pull requests. For instance, like if a customer support person creates an issue, then Doistbot will like triage this and also try to apply a fix and then assign it to an engineer to review it. And I can imagine, as you kind of go along, you will actually have more of these bots. I mean, you could also imagine you can have like a finance bot, where like you have all of your like finance knowledge and it's connected to finance systems, and then suddenly you can create reports and like make finance accessible to everybody. So that is kind of like what we're working on right now. But I do think there's also like something very interesting here, like from product perspective, and that's also something I hope we can kind of like figure out. Because I do think future organizations will be kind of like organizations where both people and agents can thrive and kind of collaborate it. So I'm kind of like ending this on just like some core things you can actually start. And of course, I don't think like anybody can become like a modern org in a one setting. But one simple thing you could do is just start a handbook, and just like, add the most critical documents there, document the stuff that you care about, and maybe also like create something like Doist OS that actually has access to this handbook and some of the core systems. Another thing to like create like these new teams, like smaller fluid teams, is just saying, start with a small team that actually has some real ownership, can actually like dictate what they want to implement or work on, and maybe like stuff like that. Remove one approval layer. I mentioned like, maybe most of companies here are small, so like you probably don't have this problem. But a lot of times as you scale, you add layers, and suddenly, like you say something, and then there's 5 layers beneath that like read or hear about this like 1 month later. Another element as well could be automations or agents. Just like if you do something tedious, you could just try to automate that. And then lastly, like this impact, like, don't measure like vanity things, like measure real impact. And I think, this is much easier said than done, because a lot of times, how do you measure, for instance, the impact of design? Like, what is great design? What is great product work? What is great engineering? What is, I think in some, for instance, sales is very easy to measure this. In a lot of others, it's kind of like, it's much harder. Yeah. So I would love to hear some questions or yeah, we have a few minutes.
Thank you. Okay, I need a mic, thanks. So human-led, agent-operated.
Yeah, for now.
Somehow.
Yeah,
for now.
Yeah.
All right, so this is the, let's say, the vision of the modern organization as you started many years ago while remote working. And this is something that can help startups for sure, and all the other organizations as well organize the work. So before we continue with another and the last fireside talk, do we have any questions?
I've noticed in the beginning you've mentioned bootstrapped and no venture capital. For now, I think you mentioned something in the initial session. You gave a talk on this. But do you plan on getting external funding for the future of the company when you're speaking about external agents, Doist, OS, etc.? Do you think that it makes sense for you to raise in the future, or you would still continue being independent?
I mean, for now, like, I think we are going to continue. I mean, also, like, if you look at, the revenue we spend on employees, it's like much higher right now than we do on Doist OS, or even like AI budgets that we have. So I don't think this will kind of pressure us into raising. But maybe, like on the product side, I do think, like, given how many users we have, that we might be forced to do something. But honestly, I think also, like, we need to figure out a business model where, like, we can actually do this in like a profitable way.
You've mentioned finance knowledge, and I'm just wondering, when you say knowledge, does this mean that you have the knowledge management system implemented underneath, something like knowledge graphs or something like that? Because especially in finance, I mean, immutability of information and, hallucinations of models and agents and all of that is a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you can do, especially like with these skills, is you can actually just prompt the like cloud code on how to handle different things. So for instance, like if you wanted to generate a report or do some analysis, then you can basically prompt it to do this. And things, so that's basically that. And what I mean of like knowledge is like we can actually encode our own knowledge into this. So like we can tell it, okay, this is what is important for us. Another thing with like hallucinations, this is actually a much smaller problem, because what you usually, like in these situations, you want to do is like you want to tell it to implement code instead of like just hallucinating. I hope I answered the question.
No, I was just. I mean, I'm issuing a bit of a challenge there because I'm not really sure. I mean, you can scale it up to a point, and then everybody, without retrieve augmented generation and any other type of similar technology, faces the same issue. I'm wondering whether you have faced anything like that, and how did you solve for it? Because it can become very expensive.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and honestly, like, I think for us, like the cost problem is not really like our employees using AI. It's more like on the product side. And I do think modern like LLMs, like I think hallucinations, especially for like finance, like the way you get into trouble is like if you ask it to like generate a report, and then it just goes in, reads the data, and then hallucinates a report. If you actually tell it, okay, create a script or use a script, to fetch the data, and do some analysis on it and etc. So there's many different ways you can actually solve this problem. I mean, we can chat afterwards if you want.
Okay, so it's a process level, not a system level. It's clear. Your approach is clear. It's fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for the questions. Thank you, Amir, for being with us twice.